Human beings have always defined ourselves by how we think and how we communicate with one another. Our ability to communicate has set us apart from the other animals. It's allowed us to build tools, communicate our skills, advance our technology. Without this unique ability that humans have, our civilization would not be possible. We define language as a set of arbitrary symbols used only for communication. With this definition, we generally consider humans to be the only species that has language on this earth, although the argument is ongoing, and the attempt to decode the communication systems used, for instance, by dolphins does actually continue, and there is still research being done. Language allows us to think and solve problems, to make decisions, plan for the future in a way that no other animal really can. And it supports this creative and progressive social interaction. Most species are sort of locked at a certain point in their social interaction, although this isn't necessarily the case. Some monkeys and dolphins in particular have learned and taught new skills to the next generation in order to help them gain an advantage over their environment. In very much the same way that humans do, they just do it much slower. The human brain has two unique areas that are specially designed to help us communicate. The first of these is, the first one that we're going to discuss is Broca's area. This exists in the frontal lobe of the brain, immediately in front of the temporal lobe, usually on the left-hand side of the brain. Broca's area allows the formation of language. Broca's area controls the way your tongue and jaw and lips move, and your vocal cords as well, in order to produce language itself. Weinicke's area exists immediately behind Broca's area in the temporal lobe and allows us to understand language. It allows us to make sense of the symbols that we communicate through sound. Weinicke's area also allows us to select the words that we're going to use. It allows us to select the words that Broca's area will produce. When we start looking at how language is constructed, there are actually a group of sciences that help us define the way that language is produced. The first and simplest of these is phonology. Phonology is the study of the units of sound in a language. And remember that these units of sound are not the same as the letters we use. We have 26 letters in the English alphabet, but somewhere between 54 and 58 recognized phonemes in the English language. For instance, the TH sound actually has two phonemes associated with it. The NG sound has a unique phoneme associated with it. But phoneme is the smallest unit of sound, and these units of sound in and of themselves don't have, or phonology is the study of these units of sound. These units of sound don't have meaning by themselves, right? But it is important that we study these units of meaning, particularly when you get into things like acting, singing, public speaking, that sort of thing, where it's necessary to understand not only what these units of sound are, but how they're produced. Morphology is the next linguistic science, where we study the units of meaning in a language. Now, in essence, any given word is a unit of meaning, but they're not the only way we can communicate meaning. For instance, if you look at the word pig, right? Pig is one morpheme, and then that S sound that we can add at the end, pigs, right? That is a unit of meaning all on its own. That indicates that there is more than one pig, right? And some other languages actually have these suffixes that can differentiate different numbers of pigs. Uh, Prefixes as well. We have morphemes sort of floating all over the place. We can even add more morphemes to words to make them have more and more and more independent meaning for that one single word. So morphemes is not only necessarily the study of the units of meaning in a language, but also how they're combined to produce new meanings. The study of rules that a language uses is referred to as syntax. And syntax actually has two divisions, semantics and grammar. Grammar is the study of the rules that we use to convey meaning. It talks about word order, for instance. Grammar can be actually extremely specific. English actually has rules determining the order in which we put adjectives. Okay? It actually has rules to determine the order in which vowels can occur, which is why we say tick-tock rather than talk-tick. Okay? These rules exist even though they're not really taught. They're part of the language, and we sort of pick them up just because we speak the language, and that's the pattern that this language uses. So these grammatical rules exist, and there are people who study them. Semantics refer to how the grammatical rules can actually change the meaning of a word. And we actually have several words that mean both itself and the opposite. Egregious, for instance, means both that it's absolutely horrible and that it's absolutely amazing. The most recent of these is actually literally, which now, according to Webster's dictionary, means both literally and figuratively. So semantics actually studies how placement in a sentence changes the meaning of various words. Pragmatics is the study of the practical use of a language. Pragmatics is, in many ways, everything that you can't or is difficult to put on paper. Nonverbal communication, like body language, gestures, social norms, social rules. Pragmatics it is in many ways why Shakespeare is so difficult to read, because these pragmatic rules have changed dramatically in the last few hundred years. And so the pragmatic things and the usages that Shakespeare assumes that his readers will know, we don't know quite as well. And so it becomes much more difficult for a modern reader to take Shakespeare in without seeing it on the stage, which makes it far more clear. All humans learn language in essentially the same way, no matter what language we're actually learning. All humans begin nonverbal, but we very quickly begin to pick up patterns and behaviors of language that we hear every day. And we do generally hear our language every day of our lives. We begin with what we refer to as pre-vocal learning, where the child is, at this point, usually we refer to it as cooing, where they're producing soft vowel sounds, gurgles and other things, and just exploring sort of how their vocal apparatus functions. It's very much in this sensory motor phase that this pre-vocal learning begins to occur, where we're just sensing and acting on the sounds that we can produce. By about 6 months old, consonant sounds are beginning to be produced as well, and we have what we refer to as babbling. And what's really interesting is that children babble in the language that they're learning. So a child who is learning, for instance, English and a child who is learning French babble significantly different from one another. And if you study this, you can actually tell what language the child's parents speak by the sound of their babbling. By about a year old, most children have begun simple words, single word phrases. Words with hard consonant sounds, and particularly consonant sounds that occur near the teeth, like D are more common to be your first words than those with soft vowel sounds like M, which is why children are much more likely to say daddy first than they are to say mommy. But these first words, we really begin shaping a child's ability to speak once they can develop their first words, because being able to produce these first words allows the child to be rewarded appropriately. When a child says cookie and then you get him a cookie, he realizes that that's exactly what that means. And the first words are almost always very concrete. They tend to be nouns, something that the child can point at. By about 2 years old, the child is expressing telegraphic speech. That is very simple sentences, usually 2 words, maybe a couple more, but they omit all of these unnecessary words like a, the, and, so you get mommy down, want cookie, please milk, maybe. This is telegraphic speech where the child is communicating only the most important words, because the effort and complexity of putting together a grammatically correct sentence has to develop and grow with the child. By about 3 years old, the child understands pragmatics fairly well. Understanding body language, tone of voice, all of that sort of information that we communicate without words, or we communicate behind our words. By about 3 years old, children understand pragmatics much better than they did before. And then by 4 years old, most children show a good grasp of grammatical rules, provided their parents have provided a good grasp of those grammatical rules. We have an argument, sort of, on our theory of how language is learned. We have sort of the nature theory, where children are genetically programmed at birth to learn how to talk. And Noam Chomsky actually said that we're born with a language acquisition device in our brain. That's not a physical structure in the brain, but a neural network that is designed, genetically designed, to allow us to easily learn language. Right? This is our nature argument. The nurture argument, promoted by B.F. Skinner, says that language is entirely learned, that we give babies rewards, either praise or attention, or even repeating what they're saying, in an effort to teach them and encourage them to make these sounds again, and thus to communicate more and more and more. Both of these have arguments both for and against. We know, for instance, that a child who is not exposed to language won't learn language, will never begin to communicate. So in a way, Skinner is correct. You have to learn it, and you have to be rewarded for using it. But we also know that only humans develop this form of language, and so this language acquisition device makes a great deal of sense, because humans do pick up language in a way that no other animal does, and much faster than any other animal. And so we tend to use this interactionist perspective to suggest that both theories are, for all practical purposes, equally important in the development of human language. That we need both this language acquisition device and the praise and attention for attempting to use language and shaping how language is used. When we look at when humans learn language, we had sort of an older theory of this. And the older theory it was referred to as a critical period. They said that there is a stage where an individual is open to specific learning, in this case, language learning. But if you pass up that stage, it's gone. And the critical period said if you get past about 14 years old, you can't learn another language efficiently. You can never become proficient at a second language past the age of about 14. We now know that through various scientific studies, we know that this critical period theory is badly flawed, that in fact anyone can learn a language at any time. But we do have what's referred to as a sensitive period. That is a stage of development where we can most easily or most efficiently acquire specific skills like language. And we know that language is best acquired before the age of about 14. It's much easier for children who are younger than 14 to acquire and pick up new languages. After that period, it's much more difficult, but entirely possible. And while an adult who picks up a new language may never be at perhaps a college graduate level of being able to use that language proficiently, they might never be able to write, you know, beautiful and amazing poetry in their second language. Writing poetry in a second language is really hard. But they can be conversational, professional, even functional. They can even, for instance, teach or lecture in their second language, even though they may have picked it up as an adult. When you start talking to a child, particularly a baby, a lot of people get really upset if you like get down on them and start going, "No, aren't you so cute? And look at the big chubby cheeks and all the things and then right?" Where you get that rapid, high pitched, very energetic, emotional speech. Um, we sort of do it almost instinctively. It's part of how we communicate with babies. In part, it's because we get a response out of them. We get smiles, we get their attention, they focus on us. It's referred to as child-directed speech, and it's actually a good thing. A lot of people criticize you and say, no, you shouldn't do that because you're going to make the kid not understand language. That's not the case. It actually helps them understand because it does get their attention, because it's more inside their auditory range, since small children hear higher pitches a little bit better. And that emotionally charged speech helps them understand what you're saying a little bit better. It helps them understand the meaning behind the words, right? Even before they appear to have any understanding of what that meaning might be. This graph here, you can see this is actually showing the kinds of the number of words that children understand versus the number of words that they can actually communicate. And you can see that children begin to comprehend language long before they can produce it. And comprehend far more words than they can produce. This actually holds fairly true even into adulthood. We understand a lot more words than we use when we speak. And we may actually use more words when we write than we do when we speak as well. So this level of comprehension versus production shows that you should never assume that the child does not know what you're saying just because the child is not capable of producing that speech. By the time the child is capable of producing 20 words, they understand almost 200. So their grasp of the language happens very quickly and very efficiently, but the motor coordination necessary to produce language takes a lot more time and a lot more effort to develop. So how do you get a child to have better language skills? Well, we have a few tips. First, talk as much as possible. All right? Actually communicating with your child, talking with them, not just to them, but having a conversation. As an infant, this starts with you cooing and babbling back to them, responding to them in their own way. And as they get older, you can communicate more and more complex ideas and actually have conversations. Use child-directed speech, even if that's just babbling at the child and making, the weird kind of sounds that babies make as well. Child-directed speech helps. Give positive reinforcement when your child talks. Don't say no or don't or that's wrong, but you can correct them, reward them, good job, yes, here's what you asked for, that sort of thing. Correcting the child does absolutely help. Using negative words punishes the child even just a little bit. And really, we ought to remove these negative words from our vocabularies as much as possible anyway. They don't help adults most of the time. We need them for communication, but they're not useful, or they're not, rather, they're not psychologically helpful. Read to your child, and it doesn't really matter what you're reading. You don't have to read Dr. Seuss. You can read whatever book you happen to be reading to your child. But reading, both out loud and silently around your child, promotes linguistic literacy in children. And then, in general, try and avoid television. Television uses far, far fewer unique words than written communication. Television tends to be aimed at the lowest intelligence that will be watching it, and so they don't use an advanced vocabulary. Rather, books do use an advanced vocabulary under the assumption that you have time to stop and look up any words that you don't understand in the book. I talked about earlier there were two main language centers for the brain. Remember that Broca's area is critical for speech production, and Weinicke's area is critical for speech comprehension. Okay? Both of these areas, when damaged, produces a unique form of aphasia, which is a speech disorder. People who have Broca's aphasia have difficulty producing individual sounds, or rather individual words. And so they choose their words very, very carefully, and it takes them a very long time to communicate. And they tend to communicate using a form of holographic speech, using only the bare minimum of words, because it's extremely difficult to produce the words that they have selected. And it becomes very frustrating for them to produce these words accurately. So you get very long pauses between words as they very carefully reconstruct how to produce each individual word. Weinicke's aphasia, and this is not a good example of Weinicke's aphasia. In this case, with Weinicke's aphasia, the patient either has difficulty understanding or selecting the word that they want to use. Now, often these words, the words that they eventually do select, are at least related to the ones that they wanted to pick, but they're related within their own internal schema. And so if you don't know the person very well, it can become very difficult to translate what they're talking about, and it becomes what we refer to as word salad, where it just sounds like a whole bunch of random words crammed together into what superficially resembles a sentence and may even have an appropriate grammatical structure, but doesn't make any sense. And so that's an example of Weinicke's aphasia, when the individual cannot select the correct words to use, but has no trouble producing words. For a long time, it was actively believed that there's a large difference between girls and boys in language production and development. What we found is that if you test very early, you find that girls actually do have a tendency to be more skilled than boys, to have larger vocabulary than boys, to communicate more than boys. But by the time they have reached high school, this has changed, and they're essentially equal. There's reasons we think that this is, and of course, again, it's not biology. There remain no significant differences between boys and girls biologically, but the difference is in how we're socialized. If you get a boy a toy, a little boy, you're much more likely to get him something like a ball or a truck, something that he can play with but doesn't necessarily need linguistic skills to use. Rather, he needs spatial reasoning skills to use them, which is part of why boys show better spatial reasoning skills. On the other hand, if you get a girl something, a toy, you're much more likely to get her a doll or a tea set, something that she has to be sociable to use appropriately. It's a tool that promotes conversation. It's a tool that promotes communication. And so we condition girls to be better and more frequent communicators than we use for boys, right? But once you get into a social environment like public school, where boys have to be able to communicate and are spoken to on a regular basis, that gender gap closes very quickly, and the boys learn to communicate as efficiently as the girls. Children during the sensitive period of language development are extremely good at picking up language skills. So much so that children at this age uh, have a very easy time developing the skill to speak multiple languages. When this happens, uh, a lot of people criticize that these children who pick up these multiple languages have a much harder time speaking any one language. Unfortunately, this is not actually the case. Children who learn multiple languages, a second, third language, or even more than that, while they may develop any one of those languages slightly slower than a child with only one language, they develop multiple language skills simultaneously, thus developing an enormous vocabulary, far larger than a child who only speaks one language. In general, interestingly, America is one of the only industrialized countries that really focuses on a single language environment for its children. And yes, many schools in America do teach Spanish or do teach French to a certain extent. It's not enough. They never teach. They never teach these skills sufficiently for the child to actually pick up that second language, and you have to deliberately work at it. Other languages have total immersion language learning environments in which they may learn two or even three languages simultaneously. We know that young children very quickly pick up more languages, and in fact, this image here on the right shows the rate at which a new language can be picked up at different ages. Okay, so if a child moves to a new environment between about the ages of 3 and 7, they can pick up that new language to the extent that they speak it as well as a native speaker. On the other hand, this language acquisition skill declines dramatically as we approach adulthood. However, you'll note that even as an adult, 17 to 39 years old, the median language proficiency score is still around 210, which is not by any means weak, right? These individuals may not be as skilled as native speakers. They may struggle for particular words, unique words, but their ability to develop these language skills leaves them conversational and even professional in second languages that are picked up even in adulthood. So while this sensitive period of childhood may have passed, individuals can still pick up these new second and even third languages. Most of the time, when we think, when most people think, they consider thinking in terms of language. They sort of describe what they're thinking about using words. This is not necessarily the case, though. You can think and do think without actually using words. It's very common. Mental imagery is this process. And mental imagery is not just a visual thing, even though the word implies that it is. Mental imagery can invoke any sense. It can invoke sound. We can imagine a symphony, and that doesn't necessarily have words. We can imagine a painting. We can imagine the smell of your favorite dinner. We can imagine the taste of your favorite dinner. We can imagine how it feels to touch rose petals. Okay, these images are not necessarily visual, but we can use this sensory memory in order to bring up the schema for a variety of different things. And this ability to think without words allows us to do enormous mental abilities that we normally would not have. Okay? So things, for instance, like the ability to solve problems. We can mentally manipulate objects and situations, even without using language in order to solve problems. We can change how we feel about things, or simply change how we feel by imagining pleasant things, by imagining ourselves being happy, by imagining the emotions themselves. We can improve a skill or action by imagining doing it. In fact, it's very common for people who are learning a complex skill to imagine doing it while they're, for instance, laying in bed waiting to fall asleep. They may imagine acting out that complex skill, and it actually helps because your brain can engage in these physical activities without actually engaging in the physical activity by using this mental image. And we also use mental imagery to remember things very commonly as well. It's actually also very common for people, particularly individuals with autism, to use this visual imagery rather than linguistic imagery in order to think on a regular basis, which is part of what makes it difficult for autistic individuals to communicate because they have to translate back and forth between linguistic and visual information. The linguistic relativity hypothesis suggests that having the words to describe a concept allows you to think about that concept far more efficiently. For instance, my vocabulary in dealing with psychological concepts is far more advanced than any student that I could ever have. I have had much longer and a lot more training in developing this particular linguistic ability, this understanding of scientific vocabulary within the field of psychology. And as a result, I can think about and talk about psychology far more efficiently than students can. Okay? And so this linguistic relativity hypothesis explains why we're able to think about things more efficiently when we have the appropriate words to describe them. It also explains why we invent new words in order to more accurately describe a situation that's occurring. Humans are, in many ways, extremely arrogant creatures, and we have a tendency to define things in a way that favors us. And so we've defined language in such a way that absolutely favors humans being the only species that has language. And one of the ways that we've done this is to define language in terms of abilities that animals have never shown. Humans, for instance, have duality of patterning. This is a rule that says that phonemes are combined using rule-governed patterns to create sentences. Okay, morphemes and larger and larger units of meaning. Animals cannot do this. Animals cannot produce verbal sounds the way that we do. There is no animal whose vocal apparatus is set up the same way ours is and can produce the same sets of sounds. Productivity is the next one. We have a finite number of sounds, somewhere between 54 to 60 units of sound, for instance, in the English language. Some languages have more, some have less. But we have this finite number of sounds, but we can produce an infinite number of unique utterances. There is no limit to the number of things that humans can say. We can say anything we want, and that is productivity, even using these limited number of linguistic sounds. The next rule is arbitrariness, that there is no meaningful link between an object, event, or thought and the way it is expressed. So, for instance, the word ball does not describe a ball. It doesn't describe this round spherical object. In fact, none of those words really do, except that we agree that they do. We agree that this word defines that object, and yet the word itself doesn't describe the object except that we agree that it does. And other languages have different words for it. Right? This is the very definition of arbitrariness. Um, Animal languages don't have this. Okay? Even animal sign languages and animal written languages don't have this arbitrary connection between the object and the symbol for it. We have interchangeability, that is, any sound that can be heard can be reproduced. We have an incredibly active, incredibly versatile vocal apparatus that is not present in any other animal. Specialization means that we use our language sounds only for communication, which that can be argued, but our language sounds exist for the purpose of communication, and while we may use it for non-communicative functions, that is its original purpose and design, whereas other animals, that's not necessarily the case. Displacement means that we can talk about objects and events that are not present, which is far more difficult for animals, but some animals actually can. In fact, it's known that Koko the gorilla, one of our most famous animals that we've learned to talk, that we have taught to communicate, rather, not to speak, but to communicate. When she wanted an orange, she actually created a new word for it, talking about an apple that is orange, because she didn't have a word for the orange fruit. Okay? So she developed a new symbol to describe this object that is not present. But most animals can't do that. Like cats and dogs, for instance, are not capable of displacement. Cultural transmission suggests that we teach languages to our children. We have found that orangutans actually can do this, that chimpanzees actually can do cultural transmission, but humans do it better. Right? Humans communicate our language to our children more efficiently than other primate species. One of the skills that is apparently uniquely human is the ability to lie, prevarication. Most animals are not capable of telling untruths. Rather, they can only speak what is accurate and true to their knowledge and their perception. And then humans have a reflexive language. Our language can describe itself. We can talk about nouns and verbs and adjectives and how they fit together. We can teach English classes and describe how our language works. And this is unique among all other animals who can't manage the cognitive complexity necessary to describe language and communication. We can think and there's really sort of two modes of thinking. We can use effortful processing or easy processing. Okay? Easy processing is by far it's a higher capacity system. It's able to process far more information, and we do automatic processing all the time. Okay? If you're, for instance, doing the dishes and having a conversation, you're actually engaging in automatic and controlled processing simultaneously. With automatic processing, you are still thinking about doing the dishes. Your brain is still processing the information, the difference between the hot and cold water, the way the dish feels, whether there's any food left on it, all of that. But it's all done more or less automatically. You're not deliberately, consciously focusing on it. It just sort of happens. Effortful processing is a far more limited capacity system. For instance, if you're having a conversation, you can't really watch TV and read a book. In fact, language is one of the most effortful processing systems that humans can engage in. We can really only process one linguistic stream at a time. So while we're having a conversation, while we're studying, for instance, you can't watch TV. You can really only do one at a time. So it's best, again, to sort of shut off your TV or to turn it to classical music or something so that you can have this automatic processing going on in the background, perhaps overriding anything else that might come in on your auditory track. while you're processing linguistic information in a more controlled, effortful system. Okay. In order to engage in this controlled processing, we have to have cognitive control. We can also call it executive function. I personally like the term executive function. I think it describes it in a more visceral sort of way. Executive function is just that, your ability to decide, your ability to be the executive officer, in a way, of your own mind, and to decide what you will think about and how you will think about it. So executive function gives you this ability. Your executive function, and it does that, it is your ability to guide your thinking. It's your ability to focus on your actions despite distraction, your ability to ignore the things around you that you don't want to engage with or that you don't have time to engage with. It allows you to guide your attention over a long period of time. It allows you to overcome compelling or conditioned behavior. It allows you to pursue complex behavior that is beyond the scope of animals or children. Your executive function lets you do all of this. And it is this executive function, for instance, that we sort of put to sleep when we're engaged in hypnotic activity. Okay. But executive function, just like controlled processing, requires far more energy than automatic processing does. And so it's effortful, and it is normal to be tired after a period of studying. That's why you should only study for a short period of time as well. Studying is tiring. Studying requires an enormous amount of energy. Your brain consumes an enormous amount of your body's energy. And so it's actually very common to feel tired after you've been studying for a period of time. Acquiring new skills is one of the things that humans do exceptionally well. And it is an aspect of thinking and communicating. When we start acquiring a skill, often the first stage of developing a new skill is what we refer to as unconscious incompetence. That is, the individual doesn't know that they're unable to actually accomplish a skill, and may even deny that the skill is worthy of their effort or attention. This is in an effort to protect the ego, in a way. We don't like admitting that we're ignorant. We don't like admitting that there is something we don't know or can't do. And so this unconscious incompetence protects us, in a way, from not being able to deal with being incapable in any given situation. Once you do actually commit to learning the skill, once you decide that it is worth your time and effort, we develop conscious incompetence. At this stage, you can sort of do the skill, even if it's not up to your own expectations, certainly. But in doing it, you start to be able to recognize that you don't have any skill, that you don't actually know what you're doing. You make mistakes, you solve problems, you are aware of these mistakes and working to correct them. And so you are consciously incompetent. You know that you're making mistakes, and you begin to see how much you still have to learn in working on that particular skill. Later on, as you become more and more skilled at this activity, we gain conscious competence. That is, we can perform the activity and we can do it well, but it still requires a significant amount of concentration. For instance, when you're first starting to learn to drive a car, you begin with this conscious incompetence where you are making mistakes, you're swerving into other lanes. This is the period where you're practicing in empty parking lots, right? So that you can begin to develop these skills and begin to correct your mistakes in a relatively safe environment. Conscious competence is when you can drive and you're capable of driving even on the road, but you have to be absolutely aware of everything that you're doing. You have to be focused on the foot on the on the gas pedal, so you can regulate exactly how fast you're going, and you're aware of every little correction that you make. and and you get sort of hyper aware and hyper conscious of things that are going on around you. This is conscious competence. And this stage, for something like driving, for instance, it doesn't last very long. And after a while, we reach unconscious competence, where the skill can be done without thought or concentration. You hop in your car, start it, and drive away, rather than get in the car, put your foot on the brake, key in, turn the key, release the key, put it in reverse, turn the wheel while you're backing up, and then stop the car again and put it in drive. Okay, so all of those steps are required in conscious competence, whereas unconscious competence, you get in the car and drive away. Okay. On the other hand, something like driving a car, we can always fall back on that conscious ability again, where you see a situation that might be dangerous, you turn back, you focus more on it, and arrive back at that conscious competence stage where you are deliberately and effortfully adapting to your environment rather than doing it in a more automatic processing sort of way. The Dunning-Kruger effect and the Dunning-Kruger curve describes the confidence that an individual has in their ability to accomplish a task based on how much information they have on their ability to actually complete that task. If someone has a very small amount of knowledge in a particular task, particularly a very complex task, they may have an extremely inflated sense of their ability to accomplish this task. And even though they're not competent, they're not capable of accomplishing the task, they have a very inflated sense of their own ability. And as you gain more and more skill in that task, your confidence actually decreases very dramatically and very quickly as you realize how much you don't know about the task, as you realize how much skill you lack in being able to accomplish the task to your own expectations. And then as we approach being an expert in that task, our confidence rises, our confidence generally rises again, although it's very common for experts to have an emotional problem in which they feel like they're not particularly competent in their skill, even though they absolutely are. When we begin solving problems, it's necessary to think about the problem. It's necessary to activate thoughts and actions in order to achieve a desired goal. And the first step of problem solving is always, or should rather be, the thought process that goes into arriving at an appropriate solution to the problem that can be engaged using action. In order to effectively solve a problem, it's necessary to engage a series of steps in order to reach the conclusion or solution that we're looking to discover. So the first step of these is actually to define the problem. You have to figure out exactly what the problem is. You have to be able to determine what it is that you're trying to do, your ultimate goal. The next step is to find a strategy for solving that problem, and there are a variety of strategies that we can use. The first of these strategies is to use an algorithm. An algorithm is a step-by-step procedure that allows us to solve a problem. An algorithm guarantees a solution. Now, it's important to note that an algorithm does not guarantee a correct solution. It only guarantees a solution. If you apply the wrong algorithm or you apply an algorithm incorrectly, then you will get an inappropriate solution. Humans are generally not good at algorithms. Computers are, right? When you look at a math problem, you're looking at an algorithm. And computers are extremely good at that. Humans, on the other hand, have a tendency to seek shortcuts. And algorithms don't allow shortcuts. Heuristics are something that humans are very good at and computers are not. A heuristic is, exactly as I talked about, a shortcut to solving a problem, a rapid task that we can engage in, usually low effort, in order to reach a solution to the problem. And again, a solution, not necessarily the correct solution. And we'll talk about a variety of heuristics here coming up in just a moment. You can also use insight to solve a problem, just like insight learning, where you have that moment of, oh, I get it, while you're in the middle of the math test. Insight problem solving is exactly the same thing, where you sort of give up on on finding a solution, and all of a sudden it comes to you as you put all of the pieces together in a new way. And so this insight learning. You shouldn't rely on insight. It's too unpredictable, but it is useful when it occurs. The final step to solving a problem is evaluation. Did you find a good solution? Because remember, using an algorithm or a heuristic does generally guarantee a solution to your problem, but it's not necessarily a good solution. So we have to evaluate. And particularly with complex issues, when we evaluate a problem, we may discover that that problem is good in some ways and not in others. It's sort of the unfortunate aspect of human existence, is that a lot of our decisions are necessarily compromises and not exactly what we would like them to be. There are a variety of heuristics available, and we're talking about just a few of them. We can use, for instance, working backwards or a means-ends analysis. Both of these are very much the same thing, but working backwards has a tendency to be a little bit more emotional. With working backwards, we start with a solution and sort of work backwards through the problem in order to determine the best way to solve it. With some puzzles, they come together, they come already put together, and you can sort of take them apart in such a way that you can work backwards in order to be able to solve the problem later. With means-ends analysis, you examine your current position and your desired goal and create a series of steps in order to close the gap between the two. So for instance, while you're writing your assignment, you might actually produce a means-ends analysis where you examine what you want to happen and then create a series of steps. So you have to create, perhaps, you have to find a topic, and then you create a thesis sentence for that topic, and then you create an outline based on that topic, and then you do research based on that topic, and then you begin producing supporting paragraphs for that topic. So this is the means to the end. So you create this series of steps in order to reach the final solution. With an analogy heuristic, we apply a solution used in a previous problem in order to solve a current problem that shares similar features. Like, okay, shopping for a car, you might go on car shopping sites and look at car dealerships and determine exactly what you want in a car and that sort of thing. So when you're looking at buying a house, you look at how you developed your strategy for buying a car and apply a similar strategy. Of course, you can't use exactly the same strategy, but you can apply a very similar strategy. And in that case, an analogy heuristic would actually work fairly well. It does, however, require, for instance, a means-ends analysis or a pro-con analysis in order to do that. But the analogy heuristic allows you to generate a solution. We can also use an availability heuristic as a way of making decisions, but an availability heuristic has a very high chance of being inappropriate. An availability heuristic is guessing the probability of a thing based on how quickly and easily information actually comes to mind. For instance, if you consider whether or not it's safer to drive or fly, if you don't know the actual statistics, a lot of people believe that it's a lot safer to drive than it is to fly. And it feels that way. You have more control while you're driving. But that's actually part of the risk, is that you're dealing not only with your control, but with everyone else around you. And being able to trust everyone around you to be completely awake, completely alert, following all of the rules, all of this actually makes driving incredibly unsafe. Whereas with flying, not only are there far fewer airplanes in the air, but airplanes have much more highly trained pilots. They have backup pilots. They have computer backups on top of that that prevent them from actually encountering each other in the air, and flying is far, far safer. In fact, with plane accidents now, you are far more likely to survive a plane crash than you are to survive an automobile accident. But an availability heuristic suggests that that cars are safer because every time a plane crashes, you hear about it. So we know every time a plane crashes. We do not hear about every time a car crashes because just in this country, there's a car crash every few seconds. We would be inundated by nothing but news of car crashes if we heard about every car crash that happened. And as a result, our availability heuristic suggests that we're more likely to be in a plane crash. Representative heuristics are your ability to guess the probability of something based on your prototype of that object. One of my favorite movies is Pulp Fiction, and in one of the scenes of the movies, an individual is talking about how he went to France and he went to Burger King, and he starts explaining stuff about Burger King in France and how it's a little bit different. But he went to France, he went to Paris, and you have to stop and think, why? Why would you go to Paris and then go to Burger King? And the reason is because he had a representative heuristic of what he was going to get. He knew that he could walk into Burger King and get exactly what he wanted, and that he would know what he was getting when he ordered. If he walked into a 4-star French restaurant, he might well not know what most of the items on the menu are. He wouldn't be able to recognize it when it came out on his plate. He doesn't know what he could possibly get at that restaurant, so he has no representative for that prototype, for that archetype. And so he went instead to a place that he did have a representative for and got what he knew he wanted, what he could order easily and eat without fuss. So that's his representative heuristic, his easy decision making. And restaurants rely on these representative heuristics. So this is another way of looking at a representative heuristic. We have the options: a librarian, a banker, and a drummer, and we want to describe Holly. So Holly is quiet, orderly, and shy. Do you think she's more likely to be a librarian, a banker, or a drummer? A lot of people would say that she's a librarian because those are the qualities that we associate with being a librarian, to be quiet, orderly, and shy. But in my personal experience, she's more likely to be a drummer than a librarian, as librarians have a tendency to actually be kind of party animals. And then bankers, particularly if you're looking at, for instance, this guy looks like an investment banker. He can't be quiet on the job. He has to be always yelling out his orders and getting things done, even though being orderly might well be a great advantage for him. This is what I was talking about the availability heuristic. The plane crash is far, far less likely than a car crash, but we perceive cars as being safer, in part because of this illusion of control, and in part because we don't hear about car crashes all the time. So we talk about 3 big mental stumbling blocks for solving problems, and there are more mental stumbling blocks than just this towards solving a problem, but these are 3 big ones that people encounter on a regular basis. We talk about confirmation bias. We often search for information that confirms our ideas, okay? So, for instance, when we have a president who's getting his intelligence reports from Fox and Friends, we're looking at confirmation bias in a great big way. Rather than attempting to get the truth of the information, he is instead getting his so-called true information from a news source that is forbidden to call themselves genuinely news. They have to advertise that they are for entertainment purposes only, because their news is so often inaccurate. He is seeking out confirmation bias and encountering what we also refer to as an echo chamber, where they are shooting his own ideas back at him in order to get him to watch their service. And this is sort of what happens with confirmation bias. In order to avoid confirmation bias, try and get your news from multiple sources. Be aware of where you're getting your news from. So if you're, for instance, reading Fox, you should also read Huffington Post and Reuters, right? In order so that you get something from the right, something from the left, and something that's very centrist in order to avoid this confirmation bias. Functional fixedness is a failure to use familiar objects in novel ways. For instance, you need to change a light bulb in your ceiling fan. You might ignore the fact that there are chairs you could stand on in favor of finding a stepladder. While the stepladder is in fact designed to do that, you could just as easily use a chair, especially if you don't actually have a stepladder. Functional fixedness is far more likely, in my experience, to be a problem with people who have the resources to have specialized tools for whatever it is that they're attempting to do. But a lot of people can actually get around this functional fixedness issue and be creative with the materials that they have available. A mental set is the tendency to continue using the same method over and over and over despite another approach that might be better. My grandmother is actually an excellent example of this. In order to pay a bill, she has to have the paper bill in front of her, and then she writes a check and puts everything on the envelope and puts the check in the envelope and seals the envelope and puts the stamp on and puts it in the mail, and then she feels like her bill is paid. If she doesn't do that, she becomes very anxious and has a lot of anxiety about that bill being paid, despite our attempts to get her to pay bills online, which is far more efficient and can actually be set up to deduct automatically. She was not willing to do that until she had physical problems that prevented her from actually going through her mental set, and now we have a lot of her bills set up to be auto-paid online. When we start looking at making a decision, particularly a complex decision, we have sort of a choice. We can use either rational or emotional decision making. With rational decision making, it's very effortful, right? This is not a simple task. Rational decision making requires time and effort on our part. And this uses the probability of a desired outcome in order to make the decision that we're actually looking for. And with rational decision making, we can do things like means ends analysis, we can do things like pros cons analysis, we can do things like process elimination. But with rational decision making, we're always looking at making the best possible decision without putting our emotions into it. However, with rational decision making, we always have to be aware that our ability to make this rational decision is bounded by reality. It's bounded not only by the fact that you can only hold so much information about a topic in your conscious mind at any given moment, but it's also bound by the fact that it's impossible to know everything about the decision that you're going to make. If you're going to buy a house, for instance, it's impossible to know everything. There's always going to be some little defect, something that even the current owners don't know about because it hasn't gone wrong yet. It's a pipe that's hidden in the wall that's getting a little bit thin, right? And it can burst. Well, you don't know that, so you can't include that in your decision-making process. And that's what we refer to as bounded rationality. That is simply the information is limited or your options are limited, right? You cannot take an apartment in New York City if your only job available, for instance, is in Dallas. You could not make that commute. It would not be possible. So your ability to make a rational decision is bounded by reality in that case. We can also use emotional decision making. Now, with rational decision making, we like doing this with very complex, very expensive, for instance, topics. But there are a lot of things that we end up making emotional decisions about, in part because of bounded rationality. Um, Things like, for instance, when you're choosing a deodorant, deodorants are all more or less the same. So we make an emotional decision based on maybe how it smells, or what we thought of the commercial for this particular deodorant. We make irrational decisions based on emotion. And sometimes emotional decision making is great. Sometimes we need it. What do you want to eat? Well, I want to eat Mexican today. That's emotional decision making, just because that's what you wanted. We make emotional decisions based on for what friends we want to hang out with. We make emotional decisions on, all sorts of little things, and that's fine. But we have to know when to use rational decision making, and that's important. Particularly since a lot of companies and a lot of groups are extremely good at helping you make emotional decisions on topics where you really should be making rational decisions, things like car buying, things like politics. These things, we're very good at helping people make emotional decisions rather than rational decisions when it comes to those major topics, in part because advertising works. Metacognition, probably the easiest definition of metacognition, is simply thinking about thinking. It is your ability to think about the decisions you make, the rational processes that you use. It lets you think about what kind of memories you want to keep. It lets you think about what skills you want to learn. It lets you think about planning for the future. It lets you think about all sorts of things. Metacognition is the ability to consider what goes on in your mind. And it is sort of a learned skill. Most humans learn metacognition to one degree or another very quickly, including, for instance, theory of mind, the ability to consider another person's feelings or intentions or knowledge. Theory of mind is necessary, or else we can't lie, for instance. So theory of mind is something we develop actually very quickly. Other aspects of metacognition take more time and more effort to develop. Things like, for instance, self-reflection, where you can think about your own identity, you can evaluate and modify your behavior, you can determine what you're good at, you can determine whether you're good at a particular skill. So this form of self-reflection is actually very important as metacognition goes, but it's also a very difficult skill to learn. Reviewing memories is another form of metacognition in order to compare the past and present, the ability to review memories and review them accurately. We do start developing metacognition very early, even in the preschool years, when we sort of hide behind our hands, put our hands over our face and go, "Ah, you can't see me." Well, that's very much a child behavior, right? It's a 2-year-old thing, a 3-year-old thing, and they don't really fully understand that. Yes, I can see you. Just because you can't see me doesn't mean that I can't see you. That skill is developed, and it's learned, and so we tickle them and go, "Aha, yes, I can," and it helps them learn this. The ability to lie to avoid punishment emerges around 3 years old, where we really begin to understand that just because we know that something is true does not necessarily mean that other people know that it is true. And then we can also lie. Fortunately, kids are really bad liars. But we can also lie to make someone feel good, right? What we refer to as white lies. They're supposed to be helping lies. This generally increases with age, although not necessarily. And after a certain point, a lot of people sort of stop doing this. It depends on the personality of the individual, of course. But some people will lie to make others feel good more than others, and it's part of it is socialization and part of it is personality. Um, And then other forms of metacognition do not emerge until later in development. Things like self-reflection, things like um, planning ahead, that sort of thing, does not develop until puberty. Mirror neurons are present in the brains of all primates, as well as cetaceans like dolphins and whales, in canines, even in felines. Mirror neurons are activated when we watch someone engage in a task and then attempt to replicate that task. Mirror neurons are engaged when you watch someone else yawn. Mirror neurons are engaged when you watch someone else smile, and it makes you smile as well. Mirror neurons are exactly that. They cause you to mirror the actions of another person. And the closer that person's face is to yours, the more your mirror neurons are activated. So our mirror neurons are activated very strongly when we watch another human. They're activated a little bit less when we watch a monkey. When your dog yawns, you have about a 50-50 chance of yawning with them. Same with a cat. Because their faces are similar, but not exactly like a human's. And so we are less likely to have our mirror neurons activated by them. But your dog or your cat, they do indeed smile. Neither face is particularly suited for smiling. They're not designed to smile, but they do attempt to smile because they watch you smile and they can hear your tone of voice and associate that smile with happiness. And so they attempt to engage in social smiles. That is, they smile at you in order to gain your favor. All right. With thought processes, as with any other psychological condition, absolutely things can go wrong. One of the, I guess, famous aspects of when things go wrong as far as your thinking is obsessive compulsive disorder. When we think about obsessive compulsive disorder, we sort of get into this impression that oh well, I'm so upset, I'm so OCD about this. And that's sort of like street lingo, but really, for people who actually have obsessive compulsive disorder, it's far more serious than that. Everyone has obsessions, and everyone has compulsions, but usually they're not huge. An obsession is sort of an invasive thought that causes anxiety, and anything can become an obsession. Most people's obsessions are relatively short-lived and often based in reality. But an obsession is any thought that enters your mind unbidden and unwelcome and is difficult to get rid of, and it causes anxiety. Your compulsion is a behavior that you engage in order to avoid that anxiety. I've discovered apparently it's very common for people to have patterns of how they walk across tiles, because different colored tiles produce different levels of anxiety in people. And so it's very common for people to have occasionally odd walking patterns across tiles. Most of us don't even notice. And that is a form of obsession and compulsion. So we have the obsession that the different colored tiles produce different kinds of anxiety, and a compulsion to walk in a particular way in order to avoid many of these forms of anxiety. With someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, they're unable to control these obsessions. They're unable to control their compulsions. And most importantly, their obsessive compulsive pairings interfere with their life. They make it more difficult for that person to engage in normal daily activities. And some things that might be considered normal in one situation might be considered obsessive compulsive in another. For instance, a nurse who washes their hands 50 times a day would be considered healthy and normal in this case, because nurses are constantly being exposed to viruses and bacteria and need to be washing their hands that often. A tax accountant who washes their hands 50 times a day might not be considered normal and healthy by the same standard, because it's not necessary for them to be washing their hands that often. Instead, they have an obsession about germs, whereas the nurse's anxiety about germs is very real. right? And instead of hampering her ability to function, it actually enhances her ability to function. With obsessive compulsive disorder, we can use behavioral therapies, we can use antidepressant drugs, and very, very rarely neurosurgery in order to treat these obsessive compulsive behaviors and thoughts. Schizophrenia is characterized by an inability to control the thoughts, particularly when we think about paranoid schizophrenia, which is one type of schizophrenia. We look at the inability to control their thoughts, where the individual is having thoughts that they feel are being projected into their mind from the outside. Now, this isn't actually the case. These thoughts are not being projected into their mind. But what's happening is that they're recognizing that these thoughts are not theirs. These thoughts aren't real. They're being manufactured in a way and forced upon the individual by random firing in their brain. And it produces anxiety and paranoia and fear responses in these individuals. Schizophrenics can also experience hallucinations, delusional thought, disorganized thinking and speech, and inappropriate emotional behavior. About 1% of the population experiences schizophrenia. Many of these are actually under control either by the individual or by medication, particularly with modern medication that has far fewer side effects than it used to have. Medications have become a much more viable solution to individuals with schizophrenia. Some forms of schizophrenia, though, are so severe that medication and even behavioral therapies no longer work. All right, so that's thought and language. So if we have any questions about that, any neat ideas, we will absolutely discuss it in class. Have a great week.